it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dose Hansen. Thomas is the owner and president of AmeriPhysics, which undertakes a number of projects worldwide. And he's going to talk to us for the next little bit, talking about risk trade-offs in radiation policy making. So please welcome Tom.
I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me 30 minutes to talk today. I don't know how I ended up with 30 minutes, but I'll take it. I think a few are envious. All right, so a bit more background about me. I'm a certified health physicist with more than 30 years of nuclear field experience. I have a master's degree in health physics. That being said, I'll be honest, I'm not the best physicist. I'm marginal at best, right? I've always been more interested in the health component of my work. So a few years ago, I had an opportunity to go back to school and finish my PhD. And rather than take the normal path and going to nuclear engineering, I decided to go into public health. And so I am a doctoral candidate at University of Tennessee right now in their Department of Public Health. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about social science, as we've been doing today. So in that regard, let's talk about a couple of the highlights of my career in terms of my impact on public health. Now, I've placed more than 100 million pounds of mostly innocuous waste into transit that have crowded roads, and in fact, 3 of those conveyances have been in real accidents. I've burned tens and thousands of gallons of diesel fuel conducting cleanup projects. I've destroyed hundreds of acres of ecosystem. I've witnessed a dozen or more friends and coworkers get hurt at work. The most severe accident was somebody had fallen down an elevator shaft. That'll change your quality of life. I've seen fingers come off. I've seen toes come off. Lots of other injuries. But here's the real kicker. I probably haven't prevented a single solid cancer in a real person over the course of 30 years. And that disturbs me. It's not all gloom and doom. I'm doing great with the critical group, right? Nobody's ever observed a solid cancer in any of the critical groups that I have protected. And in fact, they all live to be 1,000 years old. So as a consequence of that, if you're a health physicist, you get asked this question all the time. What's a health physicist? And the answer that I've developed over the years is I protect imaginary people from exaggerated hazards. And in the process, I create real hazards for real people. So I protect those people too, but not nearly as well. And the fact that everybody laughs is because it's true, right? Right? It's true, and that should disturb us. It's funny, but it's disturbing. So this is the nature of my research. I wanted to look into why this is happening and how we change this. And so I scribbled out what I think ideal policy making might look like. If we take someone with good intentions and we give that person perfect knowledge, we would expect them to conduct behaviors that lead to policies that make the public healthier. But we all know this isn't how policy making works, right? Something is wrong here. And it's not that people don't have good intentions. Everybody in this room has a great intention, I'm sure. It's that we're not dealing with perfect knowledge. And here's part of the problem that we've been talking about all week, right? Which of these curves do you pick? But the picking is the problem, right? When I think about the picking is a behavior that we're doing. We don't know. Everybody's ready to pick a curve, stand up here in the front of the room, shout what your opinion is, surround yourself with research that supports your opinion. Some people are losing sleep over this. This is a behavioral thing, right? We can look at this with behavioral models, and one of the most popular behavioral models in public health is what's called moral disengagement theory. It's a model that's been around for a while. It's by Bandura, and to me, it clearly indicates some of the behaviors we've seen this week, right? We have to do it for the children. That's palliative comparison, right? What's more important in protecting children? Sure, some workers got killed, but they were workers. They got a paycheck, right? That's minimizing, ignoring, or misconstruing consequences. It's dehumanizing those workers. We wouldn't do that if those workers were our children or our parents. The gentleman to my left here had said that he's ready to consider change in his country. He needs IAEA to give him some guidance. In turn, IAEA said, I need ICRP to give me some guidance, or I need you to tell me what guidance you want me to give you. That's displacement of responsibility. That's diffusion of responsibility. So I'm seeing this over and over again these last few days. I have seen where I'm on the right path with this model. My research is headed in the right direction. All right, so now let's talk about risk trade-offs. Trading one risk for another is a phenomenon we encounter in everyday decision-making. All right? Coming here to this conference was a risk. If you got on an airplane, there was some risk of being involved in an accident on the way here. But you decided coming here outweighed that risk, right? But let's say we had this conference a week ago or 2 weeks ago in Charlotte, North Carolina, at the time the hurricane was coming. Completely different decision, right? We go through this decision-making process time and time again every single day. And just like it's a pervasive part of our regular lives, it's a pervasive part of policymaking. Now, the risks unintentionally or knowingly fostered are called countervailing risks, and we describe them in familiar terms such as side effects, collateral damage, unintentional consequences. Choosing to manage one risk over another is called a risk trade-off. And we can use this system of tools that's available to risk assessors called comparative risk assessment to help us analyze the risks associated with our decision-making as a means of optimizing our decision-making. So a framework for analyzing this risk trade-offs was proposed in 1995. You know, it is in the same stream of analysis as cost-benefit analysis, but it's different in that we're not trying to analyze things in terms of monetary benefit, right? It is risk versus risk. Operation in this framework consists of identifying risk trade-offs, weighing the comparative importance of the target and the countervailing risks, and then exploring opportunities to reduce overall risk. What it is it's a whole patient approach to policymaking, right? At the end of the day, we want people to be healthier. Now, a half hour is not enough time to talk about everything I want to talk about. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this slide other than saying I'll admit that making meaningful comparisons to measure risk versus risk is tough. But just because it's tough doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And you can read it on your own. It's some of the things you should examine when you're comparing risk versus risk. Now, I'm not some loon up here saying that we should try some new framework that's never been tested before. Risk trade-off analysis is already required by some of our nation's laws. Office of Management and Budget has used it before in its analysis of policymaking. And the literature is rich where risk trade-off analysis, this framework, has been used to look at almost every single environmental hazard you can think of on the planet except radiation. Right? A search of PubMed returns the big goose egg when it comes to risk trade-off analysis and radiation policies. All right. So now we're moving to me, which is some of the more important content here. So if you slept through the rest or plan on sleeping at the last 10 minutes, pay attention now. And think about how this applies to us, right? Are we part of the problem? Are we part of what's the issue here that is causing us to trade risk versus risk? Right? These are the sources of risk trade-off, and the first is emitted voice. Right? Everybody in society has to be represented. And as I think Roger pointed out at the beginning of the conference, you know, we're not a cross-section of society. And I think the speakers before me this morning demonstrated that to everybody very well. I'd go as far as saying we're not even a cross-section of the people in our community. Right? You either have to live out here in Washington State or be willing to fly across the country and come here. There's a cost of admission to get in the door that you have to be willing to pay or your employer has to pay. And this has to be a topic that you're passionate about. Right? So we're not even a cross-section of the people we think we're a cross-section of. And I've heard some talk about making some decisions at this conference, and it's too early. We need to get input from those other people. We're not enough people. Right? We need to know what the rest of our actual community wants to do. Heuristics is the cognitive tools we use to sort through vast amounts of information, tendencies to focus on immediate concerns, Recent events and crises, like things like Fukushima, are viewed as important issues that lead us down a certain path of be willing to trade risk for risk. Old technology bias. Change is difficult. Are we talking about any old technologies or methods this week? Right? Is linear no threshold to old technology? Yes, but so is hormesis. We've been talking about that for decades. These are all old technologies. And by talking about them over and over again, we haven't made any progress. Maybe it's time to think outside the box, right? Maybe it's time to say, are we ever going to decide something based on these curves we're presented, or do we have to look to the social sciences, right? Can we look at something like consensus to decide what's safe? Bounded roles. This is an unfortunate consequence of specialization, and the United States has got bounded roles like you would not believe. We have all these different agencies with different jurisdictions, and we populate them with people with certain expertise. And guess what? All those people think alike, they act alike, they talk alike, they are in the same circles, they hear from the same players all the time, they're concerned with one specific risk and not other risks. It's not surprising that they're making the decisions that they're making. Now, this results in a fragmented patchwork of regulations that aren't seeking common goals. And then finally, we have human behavioral responses. Public health interventions are almost aimed at influencing behavior, and sometimes we don't get the right result. A good example of this to me is BRC. NRC was just doing what they were asked by Congress when they came out with BRC, where they were exhibiting the behavior that they were asked to exhibit, and guess what? They got beat up bad. So today, even though BRC may be the best option, that may be the path we should go, nobody's recommending it, right? Because what kind of behavior is NRC going to exhibit now? No way, we've been beat up before. We learned that lesson. Find us a different way to do this. So I hope that going through examining those sources of risk trade-offs, you can see how this is applicable to radiation policymaking. And so if we're having risk trade-offs occur, maybe we need to do a risk trade-off analysis and determining if our regs are really optimized. So the way risk trade-off analysis starts is with this typology. What you do is you identify the target risk that you're interested in reducing, and then you consider what kind of countervailing risks could be generated as a result of that policy. And you first determine if they are affecting, if it's the same risk or a different risk. Is it, my one risk is radiation-induced cancers, and I'm looking at transportation accidents. All right, two different risks. And then is it affecting the same population, or is it impacting a different population? And then we put together a typology to look at them. Now, let's run through one of the projects that my company has completed. Right, so if we would have went out in this field before we dug up the dirt, we could have taken radiation detectors out there, we could have measured radioactivity. In fact, we could have measured enough radioactivity that would cause us to clean up the site to 25 milligram per year, which is standard US cleanup criteria. In this instance, it wasn't accomplished in an NRC state, it was accomplished in an agreement state that had a release criteria of 15 milligram per year. Right, so somebody in that state thinks it's in the public's best interest to clean up this site below 25 milligram per year. All right. Oops. I made a mistake everybody else did, and all right, here we go. And you can just look at the picture and see there's a variety of other hazards there, right? The hazard here in the middle of nowhere is probably not the fact that we can detect radiation. Right, so this is how risk trade-off then works. So what's the target risk? Well, we're looking at reducing radiation-induced cancers primarily in this theoretical critical group. That critical group isn't real people, remember. That is the resident farmer scenario. Resident farmer is going to live there sometime over the next 1,000 years. All right, so what are the countervailing risks? And these are just a few. We're going through this quick as an example. We're reducing cancers in this critical group, but that work has to be accomplished by real workers. So those real workers are subjected to radiation. And so they have a possibility of getting radiation-induced cancer. So here it's the same risk, but it's in a different population, so we would call that a risk transfer. But there's other ways to get hurt. Slip, strips, and falls, back injuries. You see there's a pond there somebody could fall in and drown. You can get sunburned from the sun and get skin cancer later. There's all these other occupational workers or these occupational injuries. So now it's a different risk to a different population, so we'd have a transformation. And then we have a variety of things that impact both groups, right? If I'm burning diesel fuel and I'm polluting the air, that leads to extra cancers in the population and possibly even in the critical group and in the workers who are there using the diesel fuel. We can have transportation accidents. Again, those would affect the critical group or real people. And then we have ecosystem disasters. Unfortunately, the ecosystem can't speak for itself. People forget that topsoil is not a very renewable resource. Right? So we're scraping the topsoil off this area, and no regulator in their right mind is going to let us leave the site like this. So that means we have to go to some other area, scrape the topsoil off that, bring it to this site using trucks that burn diesel fuel, excavators that burn diesel fuel, workers digging up the topsoil who can get work or who can get hurt. There's all those risks associated with it. And there's the bugs and the bunnies and all those things that are important to the environment. Right? This property was fully treed before we did this work. Right? So we have to consider all of those risks. And you're trying to consider every single risk associated with your policy decisions. So I think Roger also said this week that everything we do is ALARA. And I think that this picture is evidence that that's not true. Because here we're practicing ALARA to reduce dose to a critical group, some invisible imaginary group, and we're not practicing ALARA on any of these other issues. We're doing exactly the opposite. All right, so what I did is I put together then a draft conceptual model that takes into account, okay, so this radiation paradigm is flawed. We have imperfect knowledge. And if we complicate that by all these sources of risk trade-off that complicate our decision-making, and we accept that the fact that we're model choosing, exhibiting behaviors that we can describe with moral disengagement, if all that's true, even people with the best intentions are going to conduct conduct leading to policy making that's going to result in unoptimized public health outcomes. Right? People are going to make decisions within their jurisdiction. If you're tasked with reducing radiation-induced cancers, right, you're not going to be interested in how much diesel fuel we've burned. Right? The NRC's never done an inspection on me. I have an NRC radioactive materials license. They've never showed up and said, "Can I see how much diesel fuel you burned this year?" They sure want to see my dosimetry records with all of the M's on it, showing that nobody ever got any dose. So when we have countervailing risks that are outside the jurisdictional boundaries of our policymakers, we're going to end up with countervailing risks that get ignored. And as a result, we're going to have victims and unoptimized policymaking that aren't considering the whole patient. So what we need to do is we need to move that dotted line down with something like risk trade-off analysis, or with redefining our jurisdictional boundaries and how we're going to consider risk. We need to move that dotted line down and put more of these countervailing risks into the purview of the people who are doing the policy making. Because once they're responsible for them, at that point it's going to matter. If the NRC had to count diesel receipts, they would count diesel receipts, right? All right, so some summary issues here. All right, so as I already said, risk trade-offs, I'm going to leave time for questions, even though what I've learned this week is you shouldn't. All right, so I'm going to leave about half the time, about 50% of the time that I spoke, you're going to have available to then speak to me. Risk trade-offs are a normal consequence of everyday decision-making. And radiation policy making, look at any of the dose limiting regulations we have, and you can see that they're conducted in a manner leading to important risk trade-offs. Now, there's been some talk in this room over the past few days about moving forward with some recommendations. Maybe as soon as this afternoon, we'll have something called a consensus. And that scares me. It scares me because this meeting is characterized by many of the same sources that are already responsible for risk trade-offs. Right? So as you're speaking your piece, make sure that we're considering whether there's omitted voices. Is heuristics in charge of some of your decision making? Are we biased to some old technology, including all of the models that we're considering? Right? Let's not pretend any of them are new. They've all been around. I'm 50 years old, and they've all been around longer than me. Bounded roles and these human behavioral responses, right? To what impact is this consensus that we're going to come up with because we're smart? How is that going to impact us? Now here's some of my asks, and these are tough, right? But these are things I would say, and some of this is outside the box, and I don't know how to do it. But what I'll tell you is that rigid dose limits prohibit consideration of risk versus risk. Pick any number you want, and you're going to make it harder later down the road to do this risk trade-off analysis because you need to be able to weigh things against one another. You know, I don't know how to do it, but why can't we come up with flexible dose limits using a graded approach? We use graded approach on every other thing out there, right? Is there a way to apply graded approach and say, hey, this is more hazardous than this. We'll apply some certain limits here. If we're cleaning up a field in the middle of a desert that nobody's ever going to live at, maybe it gets its own dose limits, right? Just like we classify final status surveys. We could classify buildings based on their potential for someone to ever live there. You know, if snakes and spiders can't live there and you're cleaning up to where somebody may have a farm there someday, that's not a good model. Dose limits, again, if we pick a number, whatever that number is, it should reflect something meaningful that can be weighed later. In terms of some of those weighing measures that I told you are important to risk trade-off analysis, the magnitude, the size of the population, the certainty of the estimates, right? So don't just pick a number, pick a meaningful number, right? We pick this number, and that's because it equates to such and such risk. And research on this is needed. As I already mentioned, the literature is bountiful with using risk trade-off analysis for things other than radioactive, but when it comes to radioactive, nothing. So it's an opportunity if anybody's interested in this kind of stuff. In terms of application of the framework that is used and how it's applied to radiation, and also the quantification of these weighing measures again. You know, how do you compare the risk of a radiation-induced cancer to the risk of a physical trauma? So it's a radiation-induced cancer 30 years from now to the trauma of losing my arm right now. It becomes difficult to weigh those things against one another. And I think I left, and I have some reports, or I have some references here, and I just point out that this isn't just my opinion. You can see here the US EPA did a study on this, and they said, you know what, remediation is hazardous. They did that in 1978 when I was 10 years old. And DOE did a similar one. It's on there someplace in 2007, right? So this isn't new or just my opinion. All right, the folks are lining up to beat me. I will accept questions or just tell me I'm wrong. That's fine too.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Tom mentioned snakes and spiders. He needs to come down to Australia. Tony, first question.
Thank you very much. I work for the IAEA in Vienna. I'm responsible for work in the radiation standards area. And listening to what you said, it actually struck me, everything you have advocated is inherent in the safety standards of the IAEA. The problem is regulators don't apply them. We do expert missions all over the world looking at regulatory infrastructure and how it works. And the same issues come up everywhere, whether we go to a developed country, a developing country, whether it's in Africa, Asia, North America, the same issues of justification, optimization, and graded approach. Justification, not for new practices, but particularly for cleanup. And people don't get it, that sometimes the best thing is to do nothing, because there's no added benefit. Optimization, unnecessary and dangerous emphasis solely on reducing radiation doses without consideration of the costs involved and the ethical and societal impacts. Okay? The flexibility is there. Read the safety standards of the IAEA. It's full of as appropriate, as necessary, of the order of. It's full of reference levels, which, as I said on the first day, are being used as limits. And they're not meant to be limits. They're meant to be reference levels. And Chris and I have discussed this. We don't talk about ALARA, we talk about optimization, because that forces you to discuss the trade-offs between benefit and risk, and radiation is only one of those, and sometimes it's the least important one of those. And you're right, how do you trade off health risks, radiation risks against costs? You make judgment calls on it through involvement with stakeholders. Everybody who's going to be affected by your decision should have some input into it. And we're not doing that. And I would ask regulators to do it not just a little bit more, but a lot more. Have some courage and do your job and stand over it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mohan?
If there is hormesis, then there is no risk involved. So there's not a risk trade-off, but rather you just don't worry about like remediation of low doses. And regarding BRC, below regulatory concern, that was a major failure because we have L&T model as the basis. Because if I tell you there is a small risk, don't worry about it, I'm not worried about it. I mean, I can say I'm not worried about it, but you'll worry about it, even if I say if it's a small risk. So saying that to the public is very unfair, that it's below regulatory concern is like treating people like, I mean, they don't matter. But if there is hormesis, then you can say, if you, I mean, there is so much evidence for hormesis, so you have to accept it. Then you can say, there is actually, you will actually benefit, you have a deficit of radiation for optimum health, and this will just add to your radiation a little bit, so you'll be better off with a small amount of radiation. So I think that will be a same for Fukushima. We could have said, you are going to get a small amount of radiation that's going to reduce your cancers, and you don't have to worry about it. Then you don't have to worry about measuring the radiation dose, people worrying about these numbers and so on. I think that's a major problem. So I think we should actually declare that the L&T model is no good, and this statement should come not from this conference, but by the representatives of IAEA, NCRP, ICRP, and any other, and NRC, and all the regulatory organizations and the advisory bodies. They have to declare. I think we should force them to declare unless they can show there is evidence for L&T model. And I think that's very important to do.
Thank you.
Take that as a comment. We'll have one last question because we do need to move on to the next panel. But and I think that some of the questions that you may have may be appropriate for discussion in the next session anyway. So the last question. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Chuck Miller with Plateau Remediation Company. We're a cleanup contractor to the Department of Energy at the Hanford site. And one issue that always we struggle with when we talk about low doses is what is a low dose? And over the course of the couple of days here, we've talked about, and I'll talk in REM. I'm old, so I'm a REM guy. That 100 millirem per year, we talk about being a low dose. Well, that's not a low dose in what we're considering. I'll just pick an example. Our groundwater cleanup standards for contaminated groundwater at the Hanford site are most typically the groundwater drinking standard. And if you look at this chart that got handed out, on the bottom line, clear over at the left, is the drinking water standard for the United States. And I'd ask, how many people in this room know that the U.S. drinking water standard is a dose rate. Okay, that's more than I thought would be, but it is. It's a dose rate. It's not a concentration, and it's not calculated in the same manner. It's not a total effective dose. It's a whole body target organ combination. So we struggle with this, and in fact, at Hanford, if you look at poster number 10, which was mine, we got over 300 individual well locations that exceed the 4 millirem per year drinking water standard. There's about 20 that exceed the 100 millirem per year DOE NRC public dose limit. So we end up, in reality, focusing a tremendous amount of effort and a tremendous amount of money on addressing very low doses. And these are ones that fall off into that projected hypothetical imaginary health effects limits way down on the left end of everybody's dose response curve. And this, I think, is a feature that we as a group and you all as members of august organizations really need to focus a struggle on to help align that. And it needs to be done not by telling everybody that, well, that was done on some old information and we know better now. We need to be very convincing with that. People tried that about 20 years ago when the drinking water standards, the radionuclide rule, were re-upped, and it didn't sell. And we need to address those kind of things again. We need to make people understand that if it is the fact that we know better now, then we need to change some of those limits, and not just because it saves a bunch of money. That will be one of the results, but it's really important that we get some consensus understanding on what are true low-dose limits that we need to address. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you. Take that as another comment. Okay, so please help me thank Tom for a great talk. Thank you.